Tonight, we are going to conclude our study on defending your faith. And I kind of debated how I wanted to wrap this study up. Because there are a lot of ways I could kind of put a bow on it and be finished. But some things that have transpired in just the last few weeks and months in the news kind of encouraged me to go in the direction that we're going tonight. And that is looking at the topic of religious liberty. Looking at the issue of defending our faith from attacks by government and by other institutions that would want to deprive all people, not just us, but ultimately all people, of this fundamental liberty that we get to enjoy in this country. And other parts of the world get to enjoy religious liberty as well, but there are places where religious liberty doesn't exist. Religious liberty is really a two-edged sword. You will find people that argue that religious liberty is one of the worst things that can happen to the Christian church. Because when Christianity becomes easy, when there's the threat of persecution is largely removed, that Christianity gets soft and somewhat lazy, and we don't act as proactively in the world as we might otherwise do. And then you've got others that argue that religious liberty is a core Christian principle that we need to be very diligent to enforce. It's amazing what you can learn in conversations with people. And over the last several years, this has been an area of great passion for me. It's an area of which I am incredibly sensitive to reading in the news where religious liberty is threatened. I am a religious liberty fanatic. And I don't want to come across too extreme on this issue, but I really don't think as a Baptist you can be too extreme when it comes to issues of religious liberty, because it is a defining mark of what it means to be a Baptist. Okay, someone once said the three things that make people a Baptist are: we dunk believers, we vote on everything, and people can believe whatever they want to believe without threat of persecution. So baptism, congregational government, and religious freedom are what make Baptists Baptists. So a scriptural support for religious freedom, for religious liberty. There's multiple places we could go and we could turn to, but one that I just think is a good kind of starting point is 1 Timothy chapter 2. Paul's writing to Timothy, and he gives this instruction. He says, "First of all, then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for all people." And then to drive the point home, to emphasize, for kings and all who are in high positions, that this is what we should pray, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. This is good and is pleasing in the sight of God our Savior. So what Paul's telling Timothy is that we are to pray for those in leadership, for those in his world, the king, the emperor, those in ruling positions, in our case, those that are elected to be in positions of authority. Pray for those in leadership that we will be allowed to live a quiet life. Now, what does that mean as it regards religious liberty and religious freedom? Well, this is basically what it means, is that government does not endorse a particular religion or make the practice of any religion unnecessarily difficult. So let me explain what I mean by this. It's kind of a two-way thing. Government doesn't promote a particular religion. And government also doesn't make it hard or difficult to practice any religion. That's religious freedom. Several years ago, in the state of California, a gentleman went to the DMV to get his license, and he had established a religious group called Pastafarians. These are people who worship spaghetti noodles. Okay? And part of the Pastafarian creed was that you should wear a pasta colander as a hat. So he went to go get his picture taken for his license, and he had his metal colander. Well, according to the rules, you couldn't wear a hat except for religious purposes. They tried to make him take the colander off. He explained that this was part of his religious observance, religious practice, and so guess what? In his driver's license photo, there's a young man smiling with a colander on his head. That's a kind of a silly example, but that's ultimately religious freedom, that government doesn't make it unnecessarily difficult to practice any religion, even the worship of spaghetti noodles. Okay? Now, Baptists have historically been champions of religious liberty. And one of the things that unfortunately I have seen happen in my lifetime is this premier idea of Baptists has been downplayed and cheapened, and in some cases even done away with for various reasons. But I just want to give you some quotes from some Baptists, just from a historical perspective, so that you can see kind of how the threads come together in doing this. In 1612, Thomas Hellas, he was one of the first people called Baptist, was in England. He wrote a book. He addressed it to King James, good old King Jimmy, and he addressed it to him, and the title of the book was A Short Declaration of the Mystery of Iniquity. It's a rollicking good read if you're interested, okay? But one of the things that he champions in this book is religious freedom, one of the first people to push for religious freedom. And this is what he says in that book. It says, "For our Lord, the King, is but an earthly king, and he has no authority as a king, but in earthly cause." It's talking about King James. "If the king's people are obedient and true subjects, obeying all human laws made by the king, our Lord the King can require no more. For men's religion to God is between God and themselves. The king will not answer for it. Neither may the king be judge between God and man. Let them be heretics, Turks, Jews, or whatsoever. It does not appertain to the earthly power to punish them in the least measure." So here's what was happening in 1612 that led Hellas to write this. King James was enforcing what was known as the Act of Conformity. He was enforcing the belief that if you were going to be a Christian in England, you had to be a certain type of Christian. You'd be part of the Church of England. Now, we kind of know this story. If you remember your American history, there was a group of people that left England and went to Holland and eventually got on a little ship called the Mayflower, and they went across the ocean and landed at Plymouth, and the Pilgrims, for this very same reason, to be able to practice religion as they saw fit. Okay? Hellas is just taking the thing here and saying, the king has no say whatsoever in what anybody believes. It's not his job. So the government can't make somebody believe something. They can't compel belief. And they can't punish people for believing the wrong things. That's Hellas, 1612, over 400 years ago. Isaac Backus, he's my homeboy. Okay? He's actually who I'm writing my dissertation on. He was a Baptist pastor in Massachusetts in the 1700s. And I've got a really cool picture of him. I really want to do my hair like him because it was this long wig-looking thing that went down to here, but I'm not going to do that. In 1774, he wrote a pamphlet called A Plea to the Public for Religious Liberty. Now, just to give you a little background on Bacchus and what was going on in the United States or the colonies at this point. In Massachusetts, they had an established church. Okay? It was the church that the Puritans had established. It was the Congregationalist church. The government paid the pastors of that church. So every person that lived in the colony had to pay a tax to pay the preacher, even if you weren't a member of that church. Every town had a church. The pastor of that church was appointed and paid by the government. So Baptists weren't part of the Congregationalist church, weren't part of this official church. They didn't think it was right that they should pay a tax for a church they weren't part of. So a lot of them didn't pay the tax. And guess what happened to them? They got put in jail. Okay? The state of Massachusetts did not disestablish its church until 1831. So long after the founding of the United States, still had an established church in some places. Every colony had an established church. In the South, it was typically the Episcopal Church because of the influence of the wealthy in the South. So all of these people were fighting, the Baptists were fighting against this. And here's what Baptists had to say. He said, it's needful to observe that God has appointed two kinds of government in the world, which are distinct in their nature and ought never to be confounded together. One of which is called civil, the other ecclesiastical government. You could replace that by saying church and state. He's saying there's two governments in this world. They ought never be confounded, never mixed together. Okay, this is a Baptist in 1774 saying it. Just a few years later, John Leland in Virginia wrote, he was friends with James Madison and other folks around the founding of the country. He wrote a pamphlet in 1791 called The Rights of Conscience Inalienable. And I love this quote from John Leland. He says, is uniformity of sentiments in matters of religion essential to the happiness of civil government? In other words, for the government to get along, does everybody have to believe the same thing? Not at all, he says. Government has no more to do with the religious opinions of men than it has with the principles of the mathematics. And I love how he spelled mathematics. Okay. Let every man speak freely without fear. Maintain the principles that he believes. Worship according to his own faith. Either one God, three gods, no God, or 20 gods. And let government protect him in so doing. And here's how he thinks the government should do that. See that he meets no personal abuse or loss of property for his religious opinions. Instead of discouraging of him with prescriptions, fines, confiscation, or death, let him be encouraged as a free man to bring forth his arguments and maintain his points with all boldness. Then, if his doctrine is false, it will be confuted, and if it is true, though ever so novel, let others credit it. When every man has this liberty, what can he wish for more? A liberal man asks for nothing more of government. Here's what Leland is saying here. Saying government needs to get out of the business of the church and let people debate these issues. Let people have an open discussion. And truth will ultimately win. And what's false doesn't need to support the government. If it needs the government to support it, it's probably because it's got something wrong with it. To need the government to endorse a religious conviction. So, I think, well, this is old stuff. 1700s, 1600s. Well, 1920. George W. Truett. Some of y'all may be familiar with Truett. He was the pastor of First Baptist in Dallas, Texas. And I'm not making a personal statement on this, but I just would compare what George W. Truett, the pastor of First Baptist Dallas, said in 1920 with some of the stuff that comes out of the pulpit of that church today. Just saying that. However you want to put it. This was actually a sermon he preached from the steps of the U.S. Capitol. Okay? Baptists have one consistent record concerning liberty throughout all their long and eventful history. They have never been a party to oppression of conscience. They have forever been the unwavering champions of liberty, both religious and civil. Their contention now is and has been, and please God must ever be, that it is the natural and fundamental and indefeasible right of every human being to worship God or not, according to the dictates of his conscience, and as long as he does not infringe upon the rights of others, he is to be held accountable alone to God for all religious beliefs and practices. Our contention is not for mere toleration, but for absolute liberty. There is a wide difference between toleration and liberty. Toleration implies that somebody falsely claims the right to tolerate. Toleration is a concession, while liberty is a right. Toleration is a matter of expediency, while liberty is a matter of principle. Toleration is a gift from God. It is the consistent and insistent contention of our Baptist people always and everywhere that religion must be forever voluntary and uncoerced, and that it is not the prerogative of any power, whether civil or ecclesiastical, to compel men to conform to any religious creed or form of worship or to pay taxes for the support of a religious organization to which they do not believe. God wants free worshipers and no other kind. And then, in 2000, Southern Baptist Convention, when they updated the Baptist Convention, and this saw no change from the 1963 version, other than just a few words maybe here and there. God, on Article 17 on religious liberty, God alone is Lord of the conscience, and He has left it free from the doctrines and commandments of men, which are contrary to His word or not contained in it. Church and state should be separate. The state owes to every church protection and full freedom in the pursuit of its spiritual ends. In providing for such freedom, no ecclesiastical group or denomination should be favored by the state more than others. Civil government being ordained of God, it is the duty of Christians to render loyal obedience thereto in all things not contrary to the revealed will of God. The church should not resort to the civil power to carry on its work. The gospel of Christ contemplates spiritual means alone for the pursuit of its ends. The state has no right to impose penalties for religious opinions of any kind. The state has no right to impose taxes for the support of any form of religion. A free church and a free state is the Christian ideal, and this implies the right of free and unhindered access to God on the part of all men, and the right to form and propagate opinions in the sphere of religion without interference by the civil power. Now, why do I even bring any of this up? Why do I read these long quotes? Well, there are three areas presently in our culture. There's more than three, but three biggies that I think are areas that we need to be aware of when it comes to issues of religious liberty and what that means for us as Christians in the United States in the 21st century. Three areas. The first is the area of tax exemption. Okay? Now, I want to make something very, very clear. Okay? Because I've had to dispel this rumor for numerous years in my ministry. Pastors pay taxes. Okay? I pay, in some cases, more taxes than most people if I was just an employee of a company making the same income. Because pastors pay federal income tax on income, and then we pay Social Security tax as if we were self-employed. So, if you're just an employee of a company, you pay half of your Social Security and Medicare tax. I pay all of mine. Okay? That's just the way the law is set up. It's fine. I don't have a problem with it. It makes my income tax form about yay thick. But I pay somebody to do it that knows what they're doing, and I don't even deal with it. So I'm okay with that. Pastors should never try to do their own taxes. It's too complicated. I tried doing my taxes one time when I was starting out, and I ended up owing the government a whole lot of money. And so ever since then, I've got a professional do it for me. Pastors pay taxes. Churches do not pay taxes most of the time. Okay? Churches are exempt from property taxes, income taxes, and in some states, even sales tax. Okay? Not every state's the same on that, but some states you can actually get a sales tax refund as a church. Churches pay no taxes. Why? Okay? There's a couple of reasons. One is churches are legally non-profit organizations, which is a designation in the Internal Revenue Code. You'll sometimes hear 501c3 organizations. The reason that they're called that is because, Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code gives the requirements to be a non-profit for tax purposes. That's why they're called 501c3s. And that's one of it. But historically, churches have not paid taxes. And the reason is because of a very simple principle. The power to tax is the power to control. And that's an established principle of government. If a government can tax somebody, they can tell you what to do. You don't believe me? Try not paying your taxes. Okay? The power to tax is the power to control. Okay? They can tell you, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, you have to do this. That's part of what taxation implies. So churches, to be free of government interference, don't pay taxes. Now, there's a specific part of that IRS Code 501c3 called the Johnson Amendment. Okay? Lyndon Johnson, before he was president, was a senator from Texas. He was majority leader. He was in a re-election contest, and there were some religious organizations and some non-profit organizations that were funding his opponent. Well, he was a senator. He had power, so he put in this amendment to the Internal Revenue Code limiting the tax exemption of organizations based on their political activities. This is what he had them add. He said, in talking about religious and charitable organizations and educational, all these nonprofits, that no substantial part of the activities of which is carrying on propaganda or otherwise attempting to influence legislation except as otherwise provided, subsection H, of course it's a government document, and which does not participate in or intervene in, including the publishing of or distributing statements, any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office. Do y'all understand what that means? The IRS doesn't even understand what that means. I've looked into it. There are multiple interpretations of what that means, but here's basically what the Johnson Amendment says. As a church, we cannot endorse a candidate for public office or tell someone to not vote for someone for public office. So, if John Doe is running for Senate, and John Doe is a scoundrel, and John Doe is terrible and evil and wicked, I can't get up in the pulpit and say, don't vote for John Doe. Okay? As a church, we can't campaign for John Doe's opponent as a church. Now, individuals will do what I want to. But that's what the Johnson Amendment restricts. Some people think that's a bad thing. I don't. And here's why. My personal opinion on this. I think it's dangerous for churches to get too involved in politics. You know why? Because God is not a Republican or a Democrat. He is King of the universe. Okay? I have seen bumper stickers, and I crack up when I see some of this stuff. I saw a bumper sticker that said Jesus rode a donkey. Kind of imply what they're saying with that. I see all this kind of stuff. Jesus wasn't a Republican or Democrat. Those things didn't even exist then. So to get involved in politics is going to, in some way, shape, or form, cause more problems than it's worth. So I think the Johnson Amendment is a good thing. The problem is the culture overwhelmingly is growing more and more hostile to religion. Not just churches, but religion in general. As the culture grows more and more secular, people are looking for opportunities to attack, threaten, and discredit religious organizations. One of the easy, low-hanging fruit is the issue of tax exemption. So here's what you'll hear critics of tax exemption say. Why should we give a subsidy to religious organizations? You know what they're saying with that? That somehow the government's giving us special perks as a church. But we're treated like any other nonprofit. But it's how language can get conveyed in a political debate. Or somebody might say something to the effect of, churches are sitting on millions of dollars worth of property and income. They ought to be paying their fair share. I know some tax assessors, this is a true statement, I know some tax assessors that would love to send churches a property tax bill every year. I know a church that their tax value on their property is $24 million. And they are not a large congregation. They just have been blessed with a very nice facility in a very expensive area. Could you imagine what the property taxes on $24 million in valuation would be? That's a problem, right? And as budgets budgets get tighter and tighter as local governments look for more and more sources of revenue, that's going to be an area where they're going to look to gain income. Okay? There are some logical problems, though, with taxing churches, which is why, even if I think it is pushed, I don't think it will ever become it won't easily become a thing. It may become a thing in my lifetime, I don't doubt that. If I live long enough, thankfully, pray God I do. But I don't think it will be an issue that will happen easily because of just logical reasons. One is, who gets to define a church? If you'll tax churches, okay, what makes a church? How do you define church? Churches automatically get tax exemption. We don't have to apply for it. We don't have to send an application saying we want to get status as a nonprofit. We are automatically covered by, and the IRS can write rules and say this defines a church, this doesn't. Well, that's dangerous when they start doing that. So what defines a church? The second reason, and I don't think income taxes are really anything churches have to worry about, is how do you define income? Let me put it to you this way. If you own a business, some of you owned businesses before, you have income, but you also have expenses. When you do your taxes, your expenses become a deduction off of your profit. So with churches, if we would simply go from being non-profit to being a profit-based thing, well, if we don't have profit, there's nothing to be taxed. So I think logistically it doesn't really work out to tax churches on income. Property, I think, is where you're going to have an issue with property taxes. Okay? And I actually know some churches that have started voluntarily paying property taxes to themselves. They put in their budget what their property tax bill would be if they were to ever lose tax exemption, so they start putting that money aside so they're used to it, and they just put it toward missions or something down the road, just as a way to get budgeting used to it. A lot of churches can't do that, though. When you've got churches that are barely able to keep the lights on, that's a problem. If you get a massive bill for taxes each year. Now, one of the reasons why a lot of people worry about tax exemption relates to the issue of same-sex marriage. And the reason is because of something that actually happened in 1983. It's called the Bob Jones case. In 1983, the U.S. Supreme Court removed the tax exemption from Bob Jones University because Bob Jones had a racially restrictive admissions policy. So what the U.S. Supreme Court said is that this violates acceptable public policy for Bob Jones University to restrict admissions on the basis of race. It violates the Civil Rights Act. It violates other education laws that have been put forward. So the Supreme Court said, because this is accepted public policy, you lose tax exempt status over this. Now, the reason this is an issue in this debate over tax exemption in churches and religious organizations related to same-sex marriage goes back to a conversation held during the oral arguments in 2015 in the Obergefell v. Hodges Supreme Court case that legalized same-sex marriage nationwide. Justice Samuel Alito and the Solicitor General Verrilli, I believe was his name, who was arguing the case of the government in pro-same-sex marriage, Alito asked this very question. He said, well, what about in the case of Bob Jones where the Supreme Court ruled that you can lose tax exemption if what you believe doesn't fit with the acceptable positions of the larger society? Response, very flippant response was, it will be an issue. He didn't give an answer. He said it will be an issue. Okay? So this is why this is a religious liberty issue for me. Because you will see more and more people saying, well, churches that don't support same-sex marriage or whatever issue it may be at a particular point, churches that don't toe the line culturally should be punished and penalized, and there's legal support for that. Now, Bob Jones University came out later and said they were wrong. They should not have had this policy. And I think it's a diametrically different issue entirely. The Supreme Court won't see it that way. Okay? There's legal precedent for the laws of tax exemption over what is considered national public policy.
But that doesn't go back to the fact of the government telling you what you can believe in?
Well, that's what people argued back in the Bob Jones case.
Now, there is a Democrat candidate that says that if he becomes president or is elected president, that will be one of the first things that he takes as his privilege as a character, as a president, is to erase and take away the privilege of tax exemption from any church that refuses to marry same-sex. And I'm not sure if he is the gay couple person.
No, he's not. I know who you're talking about. It's one of the other one. And this is my response to that statement. Really, two things. One is, the president does not have the authority to legislate. And so, candidates for public office can say whatever they want to. They have to get it through the process.
They always do
So I mean, that's one thing. But I think the larger issue that concerns me about that statement is the fact that, if someone, in a public forum can make that kind of statement openly, and it makes no difference what political party that person's part of. It makes no difference what other positions they hold. If a person can make that statement in a public forum and not get laughed off the stage, that shows just how far culturally this issue has gone and how much misunderstanding there is. And that's why I think it's so important that as Christians we be informed on religious liberty issues, because we want, like Paul told Timothy, to live a quiet life. This is not something that churches have brought up and said, we're pushing this agenda. It's been thrust upon us. We're having to respond to issues that we did not choose this to be the issue. And there's a lot of legal gray area in some of this, because for years these issues were never even brought up. Not that churches had special status, but religious liberty is enshrined. It's the First Amendment, the first part of the First Amendment of the Constitution. Congress shall make no law concerning an establishment of religion or the free exercise thereof. It's the very first part of the Bill of Rights. It's the first freedom that document enshrines. It doesn't give us that freedom. Something that I think people sometimes forget. The Constitution, the Bill of Rights, does not give freedom. It recognizes existing freedoms. Okay? And so, freedom of religion, people died. Thomas Hellas, that I mentioned in the 1612 book that was, on the mystery of iniquity, he wrote that book, tried to deliver it to King James. He was arrested and died in jail because of that. Because he wouldn't bow the knee. I love the response, the Hebrew children, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Nebuchadnezzar builds the statue. They're supposed to bow down. They don't. The thread is going to be thrown in the fiery furnace. I love their response to the king. He says, "We will not bow down. We believe that God can and will deliver us. But even if He doesn't, we still won't bow." See, I think that's a courage that too many Christians don't have. Because here's what's going to happen. I see this as clear because we got a lot of wimpy Christians, a lot of wimpy churches. The government starts threatening the removal of tax exemption. You're going to have a lot of churches start revising their doctrinal statements to match the culture, so they don't lose tax exemption, so they don't have to pay extra. I mean, it's a threat. So I don't worry about a presidential candidate saying that so much. I just worry about the fact that the culture sees that and says, okay. I mean, that's what worries me. Because, presidents don't legislate, they enforce the laws. So that's the tax exemption issue. Two more very quick issues. Public accommodations. Wedding venues. Once again, it goes back to the whole same-sex marriage issue. There has been debate in a lot of states. This is more of a state issue than a federal government issue. But that churches are considered public accommodations if they allow outsiders, outside members, or outside non-members, to rent their facility. Some states have laws. South Carolina does not, but some states have laws that if a organization rents their facility, they are considered a public accommodation. And if you are a public accommodation, then you are responsible for the conditions of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which in and of itself is a great piece of legislation. It protects against racial discrimination. There was actually a case argued this past week before the Supreme Court that will be decided this term. So before the end of June of next year, this decision will be handed down by the Supreme Court over whether the word sex in the Civil Rights Act means gender, transgender, sexual orientation. Okay? So the Civil Rights Act, which bars discrimination on the basis of sex, does that give the right of churches that are public accommodations based on the laws of certain states? Does that give them the right to deny the use of their facilities to groups of which they find them unacceptable morally or sinful behaviors or whatever? Okay? This is an issue. It kind of boils down to the whole, the whole baker and photographer issue for weddings that gets argued in the courts. If I own a small business, you serve whoever comes in. People's money is as good as anybody else's. But there's a difference when your artistic expression is involved in the performance of your business, because it would imply an endorsement of an action. So you have to be very careful. But so should a person be forced to provide artistic abilities in the performance of an act that person holds as personally in contradiction to their religious beliefs? That's the question that the courts are having to decide. And I think a lot of we have failed as Christians, and Baptists in particular, of letting the world know what religious liberty means. It's good for everybody. A free church and a free state is a good thing. And then insurance. Blessed insurance. Blessed Blue Cross Blue Shield, all this stuff. Can a religious organization be required by law to provide medical coverage for procedures or medications that are contrary to religious beliefs? This is the case, the Little Sisters of the Poor. The group of nuns, are they required to provide access to abortion? Or to abortifacients, medication that can induce an abortion. So these are issues that as a Catholic group, it goes against their religious convictions. Can the government force them by law to do this? These are religious liberty issues. Okay? These are the kind of issues that are going to be decided in the next 10 years. No question about that. These are the issues that are going to be decided. These are on the front burner in the cultural debates today. You may not hear much about them on the news. They are very present in our culture. So, what should we Christians do? First, know that the necessity of religious freedom for the protection of individual conscience. Like I said, a free church is essential to a free society. If a government can penalize a person or a church for what they believe, nothing is safe. And that's not a drastic statement. That's a very true statement. History has borne that out. So we need to know the necessity of religious freedom. Second, to pray for those in elected office. Okay? And I'm not making a political statement on this, but no matter what party the person in public office is a member of, or who you voted for, pray for them. Okay? There is nothing wrong with praying for somebody about someone for whom you disagree vehemently. Okay? And I'm not saying pray, Lord, get them. Right? Don't pray that. Okay? Pray that God will open their eyes to see the glory of the gospel. Nothing would be better to me than for whoever's in the Oval Office, for whoever's in Congress, for whoever's in the Senate, for them to say, we know Jesus now. Okay? And not for political purposes, because they really met Jesus. Because here's one thing I've learned about politicians. You may not know this, but they lie. Okay? All right? You know how to know if a politician's lying? That mouth's moving. That's the old saying, right? So pray for those in elected office. Third, exercise your right to vote and vote on the basis of your conscience. One way to exercise your religious liberty is to vote your conscience. Okay? Vote your conscience. Understand, there is no Christian political party. Political parties can't be Christian. Only people can be Christian. Okay? In my experience, there has never been a candidate for public office of which I have agreed 100% of the time with. Never. Okay? Probably the only one I've ever agreed with 100% of the time was George Washington. And I wasn't alive. Okay? But the point being is that, you're not going to be in 100% agreement with it. Sometimes you just got to vote your conscience. Okay? But be able to put your head on the pillow at night and sleep knowing that you've exercised your responsibility as a citizen to vote, if you at all possible can. But then fourth, trust that God is bigger than any government action. That's key. So what if they take away our tax exemption? Jesus is still king. So what if they say we have to do this on threat of jail? Lock us up. Persecution is normal for Christians. If they made Christianity illegal tomorrow, would there be enough evidence against you to go to jail? It's a good question. The problem is there are so many people in our world that claim to be Christian because it's easy, it's convenient, it's still socially acceptable in a lot of areas. I know a story. I don't know this person personally, but I've heard this story told to me by this person, that they had a friend of theirs who was a professing atheist who went to the local First Baptist church in the town he moved to and asked to join the church because of business connections he could make in that church. He's an atheist. And the church voted him in as a member. Because he was a good tither. Sadly, there's a lot of truth to those kind of stories. Happen more often than we want to imagine. But religious liberty is something that's so important for us as individuals to be promoters of it. And not just, and here's really where it gets hard. Religious liberty means that I support the right of someone that I disagree with vehemently to worship according to their conscience. That's where it can get tough. Okay? A religious group that I think is repugnant has to have the same right of worship as I do. And we have to promote that. Okay? We can't fight against it because, here's a good quote. It has nothing to do with this issue per se. Martin Niemöller, somebody that I would encourage you to be familiar with his name. He was a German Lutheran pastor in the 1920s and 30s when Hitler came to power. And he became a person who was against the Nazis, but because of his church position, he felt he shouldn't speak up on these issues. And finally, he was actually thrown in jail. And after the war, he was released from the prison he was in, and he would go around and he would share his story with churches and groups and everything. And he would always close his testimony with this quote. He says, "When they came for the trade unionists, I did not speak up because I was not a trade unionist. When they came for the Jews, I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. When they came for the communists, I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. When they came for me, there was no one left to speak up. So just because it doesn't affect you now, doesn't mean it can't affect you later. So we have to be very careful that we have our ear to the ground on these issues. Because if they can go after this group, they come after us.
And not to vote means that if that person that is really worse than the other one goes in, you really voted for him because you didn't vote against him. So you need to vote. You need to pick one of the two.
Well, I would almost argue, we have two dominant political parties, but they're not the only ones on the ballot.
Well, I'm talking about any person.
I know.
In person, any
Right.
person.
Right.
I don't care what the party is. If you believe in this guy's what he's standing for, and this guy over here's got some bad qualities too, if you don't go vote because you don't like either one of them, you're voting for the person that goes in. So you have to pick out. You have to make a choice.
Right. But I would say vote your conscience, and vote for the person that you can, in good conscience, vote for.
But vote.
Okay? But vote. Okay? If possible. But,
Hit your ride.
okay. Any questions? I got about 30 seconds.
Miss Desi Stedman was our government teacher when we went to school. She did not believe in the government having anything to do with the schools, because at one point in time she said they would rule what we taught, how we carry out a school business, and also she taught voting.
Well, let me recommend a book. Y'all know I'm a reader. I'll recommend a book. And it's written by a man by the name of Carl Trueman. Trueman as in true man. Trueman. He's British. He's a British theologian who lives and teaches in the United States. And the title of the book is Republicrat. Republicrat. And here's the premise of the book. Okay? Here's the premise of the book. Him being British, there are certain things of which he is accustomed to as a British person brought up and growing up, that when he came to the United States, absolutely shocked him that Christians were against. That he saw nothing in the Bible, one way or the other, on certain political issues. So it's just a really eye-opening exploration of how so many times we equate this is the Christian position on issues when really the Bible doesn't talk about certain things, and you can differ on those issues politically on certain issues. So it's a good book to just kind of maybe expose a little bit some of the cultural conditioning that happens in the United States by certain political philosophies, and just to be aware of it. I'm not trying to change anybody's mind on anything. Just to be aware when someone from the outside comes in and talks on these issues, it can be quite. And he's a Christian, so he's talking about it from a Christian perspective. He's not trying to persuade people to vote one way or the other. He's just saying this is what I observed as a British citizen living in the United States, and to see the differences between the two systems. Okay? Let's pray. Father, I thank you that you call us to you, and that the gospel sets us free. And we are free in you, regardless of what the government may say. And so help us, Father, to fight on our knees for those things that matter. And to be people that are not afraid to speak up when there is injustice in the world. We thank you, Father. Yes, all this in Jesus' name. Amen.